There is a specific kind of terror when you realize the sheer scale of a failure you're responsible for.
Mhm.
It's this moment where you look at the metrics and it's either entirely paralyzing or it's the ultimate liberation.
Right, because when the floor completely falls out from under you, um, all the conventional rules of engagement just evaporate. You are suddenly free to do the unthinkable because the safe route is already gone.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we are getting into in this deep dive. We are unpacking a narrative today that honestly feels like it was engineered in a Hollywood boardroom.
Mhm.
But it is a completely true masterclass study in corporate strategy.
Hmm.
We're looking at what happens when the ultimate underdog, teetering on the absolute brink of total collapse, takes on an undisputed sleeping giant. We're talking about Lisa Su, the resurrection of AMD, and this incredibly high-stakes battle for the future of computing.
It's a phenomenal case study, really, because it strips away all the standard corporate jargon and forces us to look at the raw, visceral mechanics of survival. When a massive entity is spiraling toward failure, your margin for error just vanishes.
It's gone.
Right. And the strategic decisions made in that vacuum are incredibly revealing. My own experience with organizational turnarounds taught me that when you are in that free fall, intuition and foundational understanding are the only things that catch you.
And to you, listening right now, whether you're a founder trying to build a startup from scratch,
Hmm.
or maybe a professional navigating a major career pivot, or just someone facing a seemingly insurmountable challenge, the mechanics of this comeback are deeply relevant.
Absolutely.
We're going to explore how you actually navigate a terminal crisis, the immense power of foundational expertise, and I love this part, a truly bizarre familial twist that ties directly into the current global race for artificial intelligence.
The stakes in this specific industry are just astronomical. We're talking about the foundational hardware that literally runs the modern world.
Yeah.
So diving right into the deep end of how a company loses and then violently regains its foothold in that market is just fascinating.
Let's set the stage here. The year is 2014, and AMD is, by all reasonable metrics, almost dead.
Almost dead is putting it politely, I think.
Fair enough. They are drowning in this massive sea of debt, and the stock is trading at a dismal $2 a share. $2. I want to linger on that number for a second because for a legacy hardware company, $2 isn't just a slump. That's the market literally preparing the obituary, isn't it?
It's the financial equivalent of a flatline. When a stock with AMD's historical footprint plummets to $2, you're entering penny stock territory. Institutional investors have completely abandoned ship.
Yeah.
But the real danger of a $2 valuation isn't just the balance sheet, it's the operational death spiral that follows. I mean, your top engineering talent immediately starts sending their resumes to your competitors.
Because their stock options are suddenly worthless.
Exactly. And your suppliers start demanding cash up front because they fear you're going to declare bankruptcy before the invoice even comes due.
Yeah.
The entire ecosystem around the company just loses faith.
And the root cause of that loss of faith wasn't exactly a mystery. The prevailing consensus at the time was that AMD's processors were simply, and this is a blunt description, slow and hot.
All right.
Now, we've all dealt with a laptop heating up on our desk, but in the context of the global semiconductor market, slow and hot isn't just an annoyance for a consumer. Everyone was looking at them saying, they will fail.
Far from an annoyance. When we talk about the architecture era of AMD being slow and hot, we are actually talking about severe thermal design power, or TDP, inefficiencies.
Break that down a bit for the structural side.
Sure. So in the consumer laptop market, yeah, it means terrible battery life and loud fans. But in the enterprise server space, which is where the actual high-margin, consistent revenue lives, it is catastrophic. Data centers operate on incredibly strict power consumption and heat dissipation margins.
Because space and electricity are their primary costs.
Precisely. If a processor draws excessive power and generates massive heat, the data center has to spend millions on supplemental cooling infrastructure. The total cost of ownership just skyrockets. So server farms were outright rejecting AMD hardware. They literally couldn't afford to run it, even if AMD gave the chips away for free.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is the exact moment our protagonist enters the picture. In 2014, Lisa Su steps up to become the CEO of this essentially defunct company. From a career psychology standpoint, why take this job?
It's a massive gamble.
It is. She is highly respected, highly sought after. Why chain yourself to a sinking ship where the seemingly inevitable bankruptcy will be stamped permanently on your resume?
That is the ultimate leadership dilemma. Taking the helm of a collapsing enterprise requires a very specific blend of supreme confidence and calculated risk tolerance. If she fails, she's the captain who drove the ship into the ocean floor, regardless of the trajectory she inherited.
Right, the market doesn't care about context when you're the CEO.
Never. But conversely, if she succeeds, she isn't just a CEO. She becomes an industry legend. The upside of resurrecting a dead giant is unparalleled leverage and legacy.
To synthesize what we just unpacked, relying on purely financial optics during a structural crisis is usually a fool's errand. But what we're about to see is how a single draconian bet on engineering changed the paradigm entirely.
And that's the pivot point. Her approach to that resurrection is what stands out. She wasn't a traditional business manager brought in to play financial games. She is an engineer at heart.
MIT trained.
Yes. She studied at MIT. She understands the fundamental physical architecture of the product. She knew exactly how to fix the chips.
That distinction between financial engineering and actual foundational engineering is the core lesson here. When a multi-billion-dollar corporation is in distress, the board of directors will almost always bring in an executive whose expertise is purely financial.
Oh, always. The traditional MBA playbook is entirely predictable.
Right. You slash the headcount, you restructure the debt, and you sell off the profitable divisions to artificially pump the balance sheet for a few quarters. They manage the spreadsheet, not the silicon.
But Lisa Su brought foundational expertise to the core problem. Because she was an engineer, she didn't just see a red ledger. She looked at the microarchitecture of the processors, understood the physics of the silicon, and diagnosed the actual root cause of the failure.
Which proves that foundational expertise is a massive advantage in leadership. She didn't have to rely on a chain of middle managers to translate the technical failures for her. She could see the matrix herself.
Exactly.
But knowing how to fix a chip and actually pivoting a massive, bloated corporation are two very different skill sets. Her immediate mandate was brutal. She cut all the boring projects to focus solely on being the best.
It's a ruthless strategy, but a completely necessary one. A company in a death spiral simply does not have the capital or the engineering bandwidth to be mediocre at a dozen different things.
Let me push back on that, though. It is very easy to look back a decade later and praise her for cutting the boring projects. But in the middle of a financial crisis, when you're teetering on bankruptcy, aren't those mediocre projects the only safe, predictable revenue streams keeping the lights on?
It feels that way in the moment, yes.
Right. So how do you sit in a boardroom and justify killing the few things that are actually generating cash?
You're identifying the exact friction that paralyzes most corporate turnarounds. Killing a project means firing teams. It means breaking contracts. It means abandoning sunk costs. And the sunk cost fallacy is incredibly potent.
It's terrifying.
It is. The natural human instinct during a crisis is to cling to anything that feels safe, to diversify your bets so you don't lose everything at once. But Lisa Su recognized that diversification is a luxury for the wealthy.
Wow. That's a profound way to frame it.
When you are the underdog, playing it safe is a guaranteed slow death by attrition. You have to consolidate your remaining resources into a single, overwhelming point of attack.
And that point of attack was a massive gamble called Zen, which we now know is the Ryzen processor. She essentially took all the remaining chips AMD had left, swept them off the table, and pushed them onto this one single square.
What's fascinating here is the sheer audacity of it. Abandoning the legacy architecture entirely to build a clean sheet design from scratch is terrifying. If the Zen architecture failed, or even if it was just delayed by a year, AMD was finished. The company would be liquidated.
No safety net.
None. But again, her background as an engineer mitigates that risk. She wasn't making a blind bet at a casino hoping to get lucky. She was making a highly calculated technical wager. She understood the theoretical capabilities of the Zen architecture, she knew exactly what her engineering team could execute, and she trusted the math.
So we've established that cutting your safety nets is often the only way to cure organizational bloat. But the hidden gem here is what happens when that streamlined underdog actually blindsides a sleeping giant. It really is a masterclass in exploiting an opponent's hubris.
It really is, and the environment they're operating in isn't a vacuum. They're going up against an absolute monolith.
This is your classic David versus Goliath scenario, with Intel playing the role of the undisputed giant. And the specific language used to describe Intel at this time is incredibly sharp. They were lazy because they were too big.
Lazy because they were too big. Let's look at that word choice for a second.
Please.
They don't say complacent. Complacent implies a sort of passive resting, but lazy implies a conscious choice to avoid hard work. It's a perfect parallel for organizational inertia.
It immediately makes me think of the dynamic between Blockbuster and Netflix in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Blockbuster didn't ignore streaming because they were foolish. They ignored it because their late fee model was too incredibly profitable to disrupt.
Exactly. How does a company that dominates the globe become lazy? It happens because the internal incentives fundamentally shift when you achieve monopoly status. When Intel was utterly unchallenged in the processor market, the culture stopped rewarding radical high-risk innovation.
Because why take the risk?
Right. Instead, the system rewarded predictable incremental margin growth. Why would a massive corporation spend billions of dollars to radically redesign a perfectly good architecture when they could just tweak the clock speed of the existing chip, add a new label to the box, and charge the consumer a premium?
Your size becomes your greatest vulnerability. The layers of middle management grow, the decision-making process slows to a crawl, and the existential hunger to disrupt the market completely vanishes. Because you are the market. Goliath gets comfortable sitting on the throne.
And while Goliath is comfortable, David is in the shadows, having burned the boats and cut all the legacy projects, quietly building this revolutionary new weapon.
Which leads us to the launch of the Ryzen processor. This wasn't just a marginal 5% improvement over Intel. The launch was an absolute shockwave because the chips were fundamentally faster and cheaper.
Faster and cheaper.
That combination completely breaks the established pricing model of an entire industry. I mean, the giant was shaking. The world was genuinely shocked by the upset.
What's fascinating here is how it shattered Intel's fundamental epistemological assumption about the market. Intel assumed they had the unilateral power to dictate both the pace of technological innovation and the price of computing power.
They owned the timeline.
They thought they did, delivering a product that vastly outperforms a monopoly at a significantly lower price point forces the giant into a defensive posture they literally haven't practiced in a decade. They suddenly realized their product roadmap was structurally years behind a competitor that, a few years prior, they had completely written off as dead.
We just saw Goliath essentially stumble over its own colossal footprint. Yet the twist coming up next about who is actually running the rival faction is so statistically improbable it sounds fabricated. We are talking about an entirely new, inexorable shift to a different battlefield.
The ultimate plot twist.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because just when you think you have a handle on the dynamics of this corporate war, there is a bombshell. The CEO of rival tech giant NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, is Lisa Su's relative. They are distant cousins.
It is an anomaly that defies all statistical probability. You have two individuals sitting at the absolute pinnacle of the global technology sector, commanding hundreds of billions of dollars in market capitalization, steering the future of human computing infrastructure.
And they share a family tree.
Exactly. It's wild.
I love the imagery of this. Imagine the dynamic at a family reunion. You're sitting across the table, passing the potato salad, smiling for a group photo. But the second you step back into the boardroom, you are locked in a literal fight to the death over market share.
It highlights an incredible duality. On a personal level, there's a shared heritage and likely a very deep mutual respect for what the other has built. But on a corporate level, they are generals commanding highly aggressive opposing armies in a zero-sum game.
And this rivalry has escalated far beyond traditional processors.
Oh, completely.
Because this isn't just about the past turnaround of AMD anymore, and it isn't just about beating Intel. The battleground has completely shifted. These two cousins are now racing to control the future of artificial intelligence. AMD survived the Intel Goliath, only to immediately pivot and face a new, arguably much more formidable Goliath in NVIDIA.
The transition toward artificial intelligence is the defining technological pivot of this century, and it requires a very specific type of hardware. Traditional CPUs, which AMD and Intel fought their war over, are designed for sequential processing, handling complex tasks one at a time, very quickly.
Right, the traditional logic centers.
Yes. But training massive AI models requires parallel processing, handling millions of simpler calculations simultaneously. That is where GPU's graphics processing units come in. NVIDIA saw that transition early and currently dominates the GPU space, much like Intel dominated the CPU space a decade ago.
So AMD's turnaround was essentially just the training montage. Lisa Su proved she could take a failing company, violently focus its engineering resources, and disrupt an entrenched monopoly. Now, she has to run that exact same playbook against her own cousin, in a market where the stakes are exponentially higher.
Precisely. The race to control the silicon that powers artificial intelligence is essentially the race to build the physical infrastructure of the future economy. And the fact that these two relatives are the primary architects of that future is a testament to the sheer concentration of talent and vision we are witnessing.
It's paradigmatic. So what does this all mean? Let's distill the core lessons we've unpacked today. First, expertise is power. Lisa Su didn't succeed through clever marketing campaigns or accounting tricks. She succeeded because she had a foundational physical understanding of the products she was selling. She knew the chips.
Second, there is a massive strategic advantage to being the underdog. When you have nothing to lose, you are freed from the paralyzing organizational inertia that plagues massive monopolies. It allows you to take the massive, concentrated risks, like the Zen architecture, that are required for exponential growth.
And finally, a crisis is ultimately an opportunity in disguise. Being at $2 a share forced AMD into a corner where they had to brutally evaluate their operations and cut the dead weight. If they had been just slightly profitable, they might have slowly faded into irrelevance over 20 years. The immediate threat of death forced the innovation.
It clarifies the mind like nothing else.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Take a hard look at your own career, your own business, or your own daily routines. What are your boring projects? What are the safe, incremental things you are holding on to out of a fear of failure that are secretly draining your energy and preventing you from being truly exceptional at one thing?
That is the real question.
Are you brave enough to brutally cut those projects to focus entirely on your own version of Zen?
It requires a level of professional ruthlessness that most people simply avoid. But the reality of the market is that sometimes burning your own boats and committing to a single massive leap is the only way to fundamentally change your trajectory.
It really is. But before we wrap up this deep dive, we have to look at the other side of the equation. We have spent this time analyzing the agility and the hunger of the nimble underdog. But there is a lingering, somewhat darker thought here about the nature of success itself.
It is the inescapable paradox of winning. If a terminal crisis is just an opportunity in disguise for the underdog, what happens when that underdog finally defeats the lazy giant?
AMD was the perfect David. They were starving, they were violently focused, and they cut all the fat. But today, they are a massive, dominant, highly profitable player in the industry.
Does the nimble David inevitably become the lazy Goliath? When you win the war, when your stock price skyrockets and you suddenly have billions of dollars in market share to protect, do you naturally start to accumulate your own boring projects?
Human nature suggests yes.
Right. Do you begin to play it safe, tweaking the margins instead of risking it all in the next revolution? Intel was once a hungry, radical innovator too, long before they became lazy because they were too big.
That is a fascinating and heavy thought to leave on. Is an innovative company like AMD destined to eventually succumb to organizational inertia and become the very thing they defeated? Just sitting on the throne waiting for the next underdog to strike from the shadows? It implies that the cycle of disruption is completely inescapable.
It's the ultimate challenge of long-term leadership. How do you maintain the desperate, focused, burn-the-boats energy of an underdog when you are sitting comfortably at the top of the mountain? It is a tension every successful leader eventually has to face.
A perfect place to leave it. Let's take these lessons, cut our own boring projects, and succeed together. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will catch you next time.